Part 1. The Forbidden Whisper, When the Moon Remembers Your Name. What if the true horror of the werewolf was never its fangs, but memory? Not the memory of others, but your own. Imagine awakening alone in the stillness of a dew-soaked forest, your breath misting in the cold morning air, your body naked, shivering beneath wounds you do not remember earning. Your fingers tremble as they touch your lips, and you taste it, copper, thick, alive. Not your blood, but someone else's. And in your clenched fist, a child's ribbon, soaked and torn, its innocence too fragile to explain. You stumble forward, the leaves crunching beneath your feet like bones too small to name, and you realize you have no memory of what happened under the moon, only the claw marks in the earth and the echo of something primal howling through your bones. What do you fear more, the beast you saw in the woods, or the possibility that the beast was you? Before Hollywood gave us its silver bullets, before cursed bites and campfire tales, the myth of the werewolf was born not in legend, but in punishment. In the ancient land of Arcadia, a king named Lycanthropy dared to challenge Olympus. To test the all-seeing gaze of Zeus, he did not offer prayers or riddles. He offered flesh, human flesh. He roasted the meat of his own son and served it to the gods, a meal of sacrilege, a mockery of divinity. Zeus, betrayed and enraged, did not kill the king. That would have been mercy. Instead, he cursed him, turned him into a wolf, but not fully. He stripped away speech, layered hair upon his skin, bent arms into legs, but left behind a trace of the man, a remnant, a scream caught between growl and word. As the poet Ovid wrote, he fled and left the house, and in the fields of Arcadia howled in his vain attempts to speak. It was not death, it was not madness, it was exile into fur and fang. And with that exile, a myth was born. This was no tale of noble warriors or enchanted lovers. It was a story of transformation as humiliation, a divine reminder that no man is beyond wrath, that divinity, when betrayed, does not destroy, it reduces, turns kings to beasts, memory to instinct, reason to hunger. And the worst part? Lycanthropy remembered. He remembered enough to know he had lost everything. But Arcadia was only the beginning. Across frozen lands of the north, in the sagas of the Norse, there were whispers of the Ulfhednar, warriors who wore the pelts of wolves, who painted their faces with blood, who howled not for the gods, but for death. They were not beasts, they were chosen. They wrapped themselves in rage and became the storm of war. Unlike the berserkers who fought with madness, the Ulfhednar moved with intention, eyes wild, mouths foaming. They tore through enemies with something darker than fury, something ancient. And so another truth crept into the myth. What if the beast was not outside? What if it was always within? In these earliest tales, werewolves were not created by a bite. They were not infected. They were marked, selected, cursed, or perhaps awakened. Not all transformations begin with a moonrise. Some begin with memory, a flicker, a tremor in the chest, a voice that is yours and not yours. And then the howl, not from the woods, but from within. Part 2. The Chosen Curse, When the Beast Wears Your Bones. Long before silver bullets, before the whisper of infection passed from mouth to myth, the first werewolves were not bitten. They were punished. They were born of wrath, not biology. And in their eyes, flickering with a savage brilliance, was not the hunger of an animal, but the torment of a man still trapped beneath the fur. In the ancient lands of Europe, where fog clings to pine and moonlight drips like oil through the trees, the legends spread, not as fairy tales, but as warnings. From the dark forest of Germany, to the isolated glades of France, to the frozen hills of Scandinavia, people whispered of those who did not just turn, but forgot. Forgot their names, forgot their children, forgot what it meant to be human. In the north, there were the Ulfidnar, men who danced on the edge of transformation. They donned wolf pelts before battle, believing that by wearing the skin, they could summon the spirit of the beast. They howled not in pain, but in rage. Their enemies feared them not for what they saw, but for what they could not understand. For when the Ulfidnar fought, it was as though something ancient had slipped through their skin, a thing with no name, only purpose. And in that purpose lay blood. They were not beasts by nature, but their minds bent, their will fractured, their gaze no longer fully human. It was in these legends that a new fear took root. The beast, they said, was not something you meet in the woods. It is something you meet in the mirror. A flash of unfamiliar rage, a hunger you do not understand, a scream you cannot explain. And worst of all, when it ends, you remember nothing, or perhaps you remember everything. In medieval France, the fear became law. Men were dragged before judges not for murder, but for transforming. Testimony spoke of rituals, of dark pacts sealed in blood, of herbs ground under moonlight to awaken the beast within. Others claimed it was hereditary, a curse passed down through bloodlines already tainted. But the most terrifying of all were those who claimed they didn't know. They had no memory, only the aftermath. A man waking in a field with his hands slicked red, his nails torn and blackened. His wife's body found in the village square, torn, shredded, unrecognizable, and on his own skin, matching claw marks as if he had fought himself. Throughout Europe, the myth deepened. You didn't need a bite, you didn't need a moon, you only needed a reason. A wound in the soul, a wrath left unspoken, a hunger denied for too long. Then it comes. Sometimes as a whisper, sometimes as a scream, but always with eyes that no longer recognize the people you once loved. The curse of lycanthropy is not about becoming something else. It is about never returning. The moment you hear the howl, not outside your window, but inside your mind, you realize the beast was always you. Part 3. The Erosion of Self, Memory as a Prison. It does not begin with the growl, nor with the scratching of claws against the door. It begins with forgetting. A name, a face, the reason you came home late, a stain on your sleeve. Not wine, not paint, but something that smells of copper and ends all conversations. And when the questions come, you find no answers, only fragments, a tree branch in your hair, mud beneath your nails, the imprint of paws beside your bed, and always the taste. Not hunger, not fear, but iron, metallic, lingering. In the ancient chronicles of the Dole region of France, there were stories of men found in states neither man nor beast. One eye wild, one eye weeping. Their bodies twisted, but not fully changed. Their speech fragmented, but not fully lost. They were not hunters. They were battlegrounds between instinct and identity, between the shadow and the soul. Some called it possession, others called it madness, but those who stood close enough swore they could hear it. A voice beneath the growl, a whisper inside the howl, a cry for help, muffled beneath 1,000 teeth. And then came the slow transformations. Not all were cursed in the single night. In old Scandinavian folktales, there were men who decayed into wolves by degrees. First, they lost their appetite. Then their teeth began to fall, one by one, until new ones grew in, sharper, hungrier. Hair spread across their skin, not like a pelt, but like moss across forgotten stones. Their speech, slurred. Their sleep, fractured. And with each full moon, the mind retreated as the bones remembered. Until the final night, when there was no scream, only silence. And the cracking of a soul, folding in on itself. But perhaps the most chilling tales are of those who remember everything. In the Trio werewolf trials, a man stood before the court and wept. He spoke not of the murders he committed, but of the nights he watched himself do them. Conscious, lucid, begging his own hands to stop. He remembered every cry, every bone that broke, every plea that went unanswered. But his body obeyed another master. And when the village sentenced him, he did not protest. He thanked them, not for mercy, but for silence, because he could no longer live with the echo of his own howl chained inside his skull. This is the true horror of lycanthropy, not the transformation, but the prison it creates, not the claws, but the memory of using them, not the wolf, but the man watching from inside.
Part 4. Rituals of Fear, When Legends Become Law. Part 4. Rituals of Fear, When Legends Become Law. There was a time when a howl in the forest could bring the fire of justice to your doorstep. Not proof, not motive, just the echo of a scream and a name whispered in the wrong ear. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, as Europe writhed in plague, famine, and war, another pestilence spread silently, fear wrapped in fur. It began not with monsters, but with missing children. A crimson ribbon near a stream, a footprint too large, teeth marks not quite human, and then a scapegoat. The beggar, the mute, the man who limped through town with eyes too yellow, the woman who lived alone and prayed to the old gods. In the village of Pogigny, 1573, Gilles Garnier was accused not of murder, but of transforming, of howling, of feeding. The court records say he confessed to tearing flesh from children's bones beneath the light of the moon, but they do not mention the hours of torture before the confession, nor the silence afterward, as his body burned and the crowd cheered like wolves with torches. And then came the spectacle. In Bedburg, Germany, a man named Peter Stump was paraded before the crowd, accused of incest, sorcery, cannibalism, and of course, lycanthropy. He spoke clearly. He remembered every act. And yet, they broke his body, as if trying to shatter memory itself. Pincers tore flesh, limbs broken on the wheel, head severed, torso burned, heart ash. But they did not stop there. They scattered his remains across crossroads. They salted the earth beneath his feet. They drove stakes through the ashes. Why? Because they feared he would return. Because stories like his never truly die. These were not trials. They were rituals, not of justice, but of obliteration. The accused were not tried for what they did, but for what they symbolized. Instinct over order. Fury over faith, shadow over salvation. The church, seeking to tame both wolves and witches, declared lycanthropy not an illness, but a pact with darkness. The wolf was not a creature, it was a confession. To be cursed was to be damned, To forget was to be guilty. In Switzerland, a boy once claimed his father howled at the moon. By morning, the father was executed. By dusk, the boy had vanished. No trial, no tombstone, just silence, and the whispers of villagers too afraid to ask questions. The true horror of the werewolf was never the beast in the forest. It was the one with the torch, with the robe, with the scroll, with the trembling hand signing the verdict. Because in every village, there was one real monster: fear. And when fear wears a cross and holds a law, it does not bite, it burns.
Part 5. The Science of Shadows, Madness, Rabies, and the Birth of Clinical Lycanthropy. For centuries, the werewolf was nightmare, wrapped in fur and whispered into fire. But then came the Enlightenment, rationality, reason. The age when man dared to dissect the monsters he once burned. And what did they find? Not demons, not curses, but something worse. The mind breaking, the body betraying. The first light came from the bite, rabies. A virus as old as myth itself. It traveled through saliva, nestled in the nerves, and awakened in the brain with symptoms so grotesque that even the most rational villagers returned to whispers of the wolf. Foaming mouths, uncontrollable aggression, fear of water, hallucinations. A farmer bitten by a stray dog would rise days later, growling, thrashing, unable to speak, trying to bite his own child. What name would a mother give such a sight? Lycanthrope. And so even science could not untangle fear from truth. But rabies explained only part of the horror. There were those who transformed without a bite, without blood, without moonlight. They changed because something inside them snapped. In 1852, a French psychiatrist named Esquirol documented a case that would ripple through the halls of medicine for decades. A man, once kind, began refusing food, snarled at his children, growled in his sleep, tried to gnaw his wrist, insisting that fur would sprout by dawn. His eyes vacant, his hands clawed. But his body remained human. This was no curse, no myth. It was the birth of a diagnosis: clinical lycanthropy. A rare but real psychiatric condition in which the patient believes with absolute conviction that they are transforming into an animal, most often a wolf. They crawl on all fours, they snarl, they crave flesh, not in story, but in hospital halls, under fluorescent lights, while doctors take notes and nurses look away. One case in the early 20th century tells of a man who walked into a police station naked, trembling, his mouth stained red. He begged to be locked away before the wolf returned. He wept as he described dreams of tearing open his wife, of waking with soil in his mouth and the taste of iron on his tongue. When examined, he showed no signs of rabies, no infection, no physical transformation, just the madness. Just the hunger. Science gave it names: delusion, psychosis, identity dissociation. But none of those terms could ease the terror of the families who watched their loved ones slip away into snarls and screams. Because unlike the werewolf of legend, the clinical lycanthrope did not wait for a full moon. They could change at the dinner table, on the street, in the cradle. And the worst part? They remembered. The horror was no longer in the fangs. It was in the mirror. Because this time, there was no spell to break, no priest to summon, no silver bullet to end it. Just a man, howling from within himself.
Part 6. The Bite That Spreads. Werewolves as Plague, Contagion, and Curse.
The legends say the curse spreads through a bite. But what if the bite is only the beginning? What if what truly spreads is the silence after? In the villages of medieval France, when a child was found mangled in the woods, they did not ask who did this. They asked who was bitten. Because the bite was not just a wound, it was a sentence, a prophecy, written in blood. First came the fever, then the hunger, then the blackouts. By the next full moon, a new beast walked among the same people who once called him friend. Unlike the vampire, the werewolf does not seduce. It devours. It does not remember with guilt or grace. It erupts and leaves only ruin. This is not a transformation of choice. It is infection. It does not ask. It takes. And in that, it mirrors the most terrifying plagues in human history. Ancient manuscripts speak of entire towns falling into madness after one lone survivor limped home, bleeding, shaking, silent. The priests did not come to heal. They came to burn. Because fire cleanses. Because no medicine exists for what lives in the blood. They say one child bitten survived. The next month, his mother was dead, his brother vanished, and he stood in the doorway, smiling, with a ribbon in his hand that no one gave him. But the true horror is not always visible. Some who were bitten never turned, at least not on the outside. They remained human, but their eyes darkened, their temper shortened, their dreams rotted. A woman once confessed she had not transformed, but when she looked at her sleeping child, she imagined teeth. When she kissed her husband, she tasted metal. She prayed, not for healing, but for a change strong enough to hold what she felt growing inside. This is not mythology. It is allegory. Because the werewolf is not only a beast in the forest, it is a metaphor for trauma, for inherited violence, for madness passed down like bone. We speak of curses as if they were magic, but some are born in the blood, and some are learned in screams. Modern psychiatry may explain the behavior, may name it, may diagnose it, but folklore remembers the how, because once a person is bitten, whether by fang or fate or family, something ancient begins to stir. And when the moonlight returns, it will rise again. The curse is not always a story. Sometimes it is a legacy, one that cannot be outrun, only recognized in the mirror, when the eyes no longer blink with your name.
Part 7. The Trials of the Beast. Fear, execution, and the human need to burn what we don't understand. The moon rises, a child disappears, and someone must pay. In 16th century Europe, the word werewolf was no longer whispered in fear, it was shouted in court. In Germany, in France, in Switzerland, villagers gathered not to discuss myths, but to deliver verdicts. The beast was no longer hiding in the woods, it was sitting in the dock, bound, beaten, bleeding. Sometimes it even spoke. The accused were rarely noblemen, rarely warriors, rarely saints. They were beggars, hermits, women with crooked backs, children who talked to shadows, the ones already marked as other. It was never about proving guilt. It was about performing purification. They say Peter Stump was a man of influence, a farmer, a father. But when the livestock died, when children vanished, and bodies were found torn open like pages in a cursed book, the crowd needed a face, and so they gave the wolf his name. Tortured, Stump confessed to everything. Witchcraft, cannibalism, incest, wearing a magical belt that turned him into a wolf. No belt was ever found, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the ritual. Flesh torn with red-hot pincers, bones broken on the wheel, head cut off, body burned, ash scattered. They didn't just kill him, they erased him. Because when a myth becomes fear, and fear becomes law, justice no longer speaks, it screams. And still, the blood did not stop. Gilles Garnier, the hermit of Dole, was next. He lived alone, gaunt, starving. But when children's bodies were found mutilated in the forest, people swore they saw a wolf, then a man,
then nothing at all. Under torture, he too confessed. He too burned. But even as the fire crackled, the curse lingered, because the villagers believed the flames freed the soul, but they also fed the story. The trials multiplied. In one village, a man was executed because his son said he howled at the moon. In another, a woman was burned because she growled in her sleep. In Thuringia, a man with epilepsy was chained until he starved. His crime? Madness, mistaken for monstrosity. It's easy now to see these as tragedies of ignorance, but at the time, they were acts of faith. Because when fear grips a community, when logic is lost to firelight and screams, truth becomes irrelevant. What matters is the purge, and perhaps that is the darkest twist in the legend of the werewolf. Not that we feared the beast, but that we became it when we hunted one another.
Part 8. The Beast Within. Lycanthropy as shadow, trauma, and the monster in the mirror. When we look to the forests, we say we fear the wolf, but deep down, we fear something far more intimate. We fear ourselves. The werewolf myth endures not because of its claws, but because of its mirror. It reflects the darkest corners of our psyche, the urges we bury, the rage we suppress, the violence we pretend doesn't exist. And when the moon rises, when the restraints crack just enough, we ask, was it really just a story? Carl Jung called it the shadow self, the hidden, repressed part of the human mind that holds all we deny about ourselves. The werewolf is that shadow made flesh. It's not just a creature, it's a collapse, a disintegration of identity, of morality, of everything we believe separates us from the wild. You don't need a bite, you don't need a curse. Sometimes you just need to snap. A moment of blind fury, a blackout in memory, a scream in your throat you don't remember making, and when the blood dries, you ask yourself, what did I become? Modern stories understand this. They no longer depict noble beasts or heroic hunters. They show men losing control, women consumed by pain, children who feel a hunger they can't explain. In these tales, the monster is not a stranger. It is a symptom of trauma, of addiction, of inherited violence, of wounds passed down like family heirlooms. The werewolf has become a metaphor for mental illness, for PTSD, for the rage of the abused who later abuse, for the horror of knowing you might hurt the ones you love and not even remember. And in that lies the myth's terrifying power. It is not just about transformation, it is about truth, that inside every man is a beast, not sleeping, but waiting for the right trigger. A slight, a drink, a moment of weakness, a full moon. And when it comes, it is not elegant, it is not symbolic, it is not kind. It is teeth and claw and the memory you cannot escape. Because unlike the vampire who seduces or the ghost who mourns, the werewolf destroys, without plan, without poetry, without mercy. Some myths give us hope. They offer cures, paths to redemption, a silver bullet, a spell, a priest. But the myth of the werewolf offers no mercy, only delay, only containment. And that's what makes it real, because the things we fear most in ourselves can't be exorcised, only chained. So, next time you hear a howl at night, ask yourself, is it coming from the woods, or is it already inside you?